I stopped just outside the living room when I heard her voice cut through the quiet of the house. She wasn't whispering, she spoke in the clipped, irritated tone she used when she thought no one was listening. "He doesn't need that much space," she said, sharp enough to make my grandson shift in his seat. The words settled in the hallway like something dropped and left for someone else to step on. I felt a small pull in my chest, not pain, just the first hint that something didn't fit. My grandson sat at the table with a workbook open in front of him, his eyes fixed on the page as if he hoped it would swallow him. He gave a quick glance toward the hallway, almost like he sensed I was nearby, but he didn't say anything. She kept talking, her tone low and clipped, but the meaning was clear enough. He nodded along even though his shoulders were tight and his fingers curled around his pencil in a way that didn't look natural. I could tell he wasn't comfortable being part of whatever she was planning. I stepped into the doorway, and she turned to me with a smile so quick it felt rehearsed. Her whole posture changed, as if she had been waiting to switch masks. The irritation vanished, replaced by a soft, overly polite sweetness she rarely used unless other people were watching. She greeted me like I just walked in from a long trip, not from the hallway 10 feet away. My grandson straightened up in his chair and gave me a small, cautious smile, his eyes flicking back to her before settling on me again. There was a folder on the table I didn't recognize. It was open just enough for me to see the heading on the top page, Housing Adjustment. The words were bold, official, and out of place in my home. She slid the folder slightly toward her side of the table as if she hoped I hadn't noticed it. She said she'd been planning some things for my safety. Her voice bright and warm, but her fingers pressed the folder closed with a quick, controlled motion. The contrast between her tone and her actions tightened something in the back of my mind. I walked closer, keeping my steps even, not rushing to question anything. I had learned long ago that the fastest way to reveal someone's intentions was simply to let them talk. She went on about how the house was too big for one person, and how she was looking into ways to make things easier for me. Every word sounded like it had been polished before leaving her mouth. My grandson didn't look convinced. He watched her carefully, as if he wasn't sure what part he was supposed to agree with. I nodded along, but the sentence I'd overheard lingered in my thoughts. She hadn't said I needed help. She hadn't said she was worried about me. She said I didn't need that much space. That wasn't concern. That was a decision being made without me. The folder, the tone she used when she thought she was alone, the sudden sweetness the moment she saw me. It all pointed in a direction I couldn't ignore. Something was shifting in my own house, and it wasn't for my comfort. The suspicion didn't arrive with fear, just a cold awareness settling into place. Whatever she was planning, it wasn't about keeping me safe. It was about something else entirely, and I'd stepped into the room just early enough to hear the truth behind the door. I lost my wife 2 years ago, and the house never stopped feeling a little too quiet after that. Some mornings I'd still reach across the bed before I remembered she wasn't there. People tell you grief fades, but it doesn't fade, it settles. You learn to carry it while moving through the rooms you once shared. My daughter-in-law stepped in quickly after the funeral, calling herself the household manager, saying she'd handle things so I could focus on healing. At the time, I didn't see anything wrong with letting someone help. The silence felt heavier than any chore she took off my hands. She started with small routines, things my wife used to do but never claimed as her role. She'd prepare the grocery lists, rearrange the pantry shelves, and move decorations around without asking. She said it was to freshen the space, but the changes always leaned toward her taste rather than mine. My son visited when work allowed, but it was clear he trusted her judgment more than his own voice. My grandson, on the other hand, stayed gentle with me. He hovered nearby when she directed me toward new routines, giving me small looks as if checking whether I agreed with her or was simply following along. It didn't take long before she began insisting I couldn't live alone much longer. She'd say it while folding laundry or clearing dishes, slipping it into conversations as if the words were harmless. She'd tilt her head and remind me I was getting older, speak as though aging made every decision questionable. I would nod just to avoid the debate, but the words stayed with me long after she left the room. They didn't sound like concern. They sounded like someone setting up a conclusion before presenting the evidence. One afternoon, she took the mail from my hands before I even had a chance to sort through it. She said she was lightening my load, that I shouldn't stress over bills or notices. She tucked the envelopes into her bag and told me she'd handle everything. At the time, grief had dulled my instinct to question anything, so I let it go. I didn't realize then how often she'd reach for the mail before I did, or how easily she'd start throwing away pieces she deemed unimportant. She started asking questions too, softly at first, then with more frequency. What did my will say? Did I really need this much space? Had I ever considered moving to a smaller unit? She framed each question as if she were planning ahead for my comfort, but the pattern grew steadier with every visit. The questions weren't about my needs. They were about adjusting my life to fit her plans. And slowly, small things in the house began to go missing. A set of spare keys, a medical receipt, a letter I knew had come but never saw again. When I asked, she would smile like she was humoring a child and tell me I must have misplaced them. She said memory lapses were normal at my age. She said it lightly, but it landed in a way that made my grandson look down at his feet. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just let the quiet settle around the truth forming in the background. Something was changing in the house, not because I asked for help, but because someone else decided I needed to live differently. And once the thought settled, it didn't leave. A few days later I heard the mail slot open, but by the time I reached the hallway she was already there. She stood with her back to me, sorting through the envelopes with fast, practiced movements. She tucked one letter behind her bag before turning around with a bright smile, holding only 2 pieces of mail in her hands. She said the rest was junk, waving it off as if it didn't matter. I didn't argue, but something in her rush to reach the door before I did stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I opened a drawer in the dining room and found a property tax notice tucked under a stack of old placemats. The envelope had been sliced open. She had told me earlier that all the mail had been either junk or advertisements, yet here was a government document hidden where I never put things. When I asked her about it, she said she must have mistaken it for a duplicate, speaking quickly as she moved the papers into a different pile. Her explanation was smooth, but her eyes flicked toward the trash can as she spoke. That small glance was enough to make me look. After she left for the grocery store, I lifted the trash bag from the bin and checked inside. Near the bottom, folded once but not torn, was a printed sheet labeled Shared Living Restructuring Proposal. It outlined a plan for space relocation, safety-based modifications, and multi-generational efficiency. None of those phrases sounded like they belonged to a man living quietly in his own home. I had never heard of the document, never discussed such a plan, never signed anything like it. When she returned, I mentioned finding a paper with that title. She stared at me for a long moment before shaking her head, telling me she didn't know what I was talking about. She said she hadn't printed anything recently and suggested the page must have come from old files. Her voice was steady, but she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a small tell she probably didn't realize she had. I let the conversation end there, though the contradiction etched itself firmly in my thoughts. The next morning she called to say a home inspector would be coming by in a few hours. She spoke as if it were routine, telling me not to worry because she had already handled the paperwork. I didn't remember agreeing to an inspection, and I didn't understand why one was needed. But before I could ask more, she said she was busy and hung up. An hour later, the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, walking through the house like he had a checklist prepared for a different property. When I asked why he was there, he said my daughter-in-law had told him I approved everything during a recent discussion. His certainty only deepened the quiet unease settling through me. If she was comfortable speaking on my behalf to a stranger, then the documents I found weren't accidents, they were steps. That evening, after the house was still again, I opened an old notebook I hadn't used in years. I wrote down the intercepted letter, the hidden tax notice, the document in the trash, and the inspector's comment. The list was short, but each entry tightened the space around me. I dated the page, closed the notebook, and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. It wasn't fear that pushed me to start writing. It was the need to keep track of truths she didn't expect me to notice. The next morning, when the house was empty and the only sound was the slow hum of the refrigerator, I opened the cabinet where she kept the documents she claimed to be organizing for me. The folders were stacked neatly, labeled in her handwriting, each one a little too perfect. I pulled out the one marked Housing and Safety and placed it on the table. The weight of it felt wrong, not heavy, just intentional, like someone had arranged it for a specific outcome rather than simple storage. Inside were forms I had never seen before. The first few pages were blank applications for general support services, nothing unusual on their own. But further in, I found a packet requesting relocation to an assisted living facility. My name was typed at the top, the sections filled in with personal details only someone in the household could provide. The signature lines were empty, but in the small boxes beside them were notes written in her handwriting, small reminders about what each section required. It wasn't the kind of preparation someone makes to help. It was the kind of groundwork someone lays before presenting a decision as though it had already been made. I traced her handwriting with my thumb, recognizing the slight tilt in her letters, the way she looped her G too tightly. It appeared next to lines where my signature was supposed to go. Not near her name, not in the administrative sections, only in the spaces meant for me. That detail sat in my chest with a quiet thud. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't casual, it was a pattern. Later that day, when she stopped by, I asked a simple question about a property notice I had misplaced. Her face changed immediately. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, a quick breath through her nose. She said she didn't know where it was, then shifted the conversation back to how important it was to get ahead of things. But when I asked a second question, this one about whether she had scheduled anything else without telling me, her irritation surfaced directly. She claimed I was making things harder by overthinking details, and she moved on as though the topic was settled. That was enough for me to make a call. I contacted the housing office directly, using the number on the last legitimate letter I still had. The woman on the line looked up my information and spoke with the same calm professionalism I'd heard at the bank months earlier. She confirmed a relocation request had been filed recently, an unsigned one, but what caught my attention was the second part. Someone had asked for expedited approval, saying I needed to be moved soon as possible. The request hadn't come from me, it hadn't come from any official representative, it had come from my daughter-in-law. I thanked the woman, hung up, and took a long moment at the table before standing. There was no anger, no shaking hands, no raised voice. Just a slow, steady alignment of facts, each one settling into place. She wasn't preparing to help me. She was preparing for a change I hadn't agreed to. Later that evening, she arrived holding another folder and said we needed to sign off quickly before the unit goes to someone else. Her tone sounded urgent, practiced, as if she had delivered this line many times in her head. I told her I would look it over later, keeping my voice even. She didn't like that answer, but she didn't push, not openly. When she left, I knew what I had to do next. Whatever she was planning, whatever steps she thought were already secure, I needed to see the full picture myself, and I needed to do it without her anywhere near the conversation. I arrived at the Housing Authority office just after opening, choosing a time when the building would still feel half asleep. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets a man think clearly without anyone's voice pulling him off course. I asked to speak with someone about my file, keeping my request simple so it wouldn't raise questions. The clerk led me to a back office, a plain room with a metal desk and a computer humming softly in the corner. I sat down, steadying my hands on my knees while she pulled up my records. She clicked through the system, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scrolled. Then she turned the monitor just enough for me to see the documents on the screen. My heart didn't race, but something inside me went still. A relocation request sat at the top of the file, submitted weeks earlier. She explained that someone had attempted to sign me out of my current home and move me into an assisted facility. The request listed detailed personal information, all accurate, except for one thing: I had never made it. She clicked on another page, and my name appeared at the bottom of a form I had never seen. The signature wasn't mine, but it was close enough to fool someone who wasn't looking closely. The lines shook slightly, the angle of the letters just a little off. My own handwriting had a steadiness developed over decades of grading papers and signing checks. This signature looked like someone practicing behind closed doors, studying the patterns until they could echo them well enough to pass at a glance. Further down the form was a line labeling my daughter-in-law as my primary caregiver with full decision-making authority. The clerk tapped the screen lightly, explaining that this section had been filled in manually. My eyes moved to the handwriting, and I recognized the same tight loops and sharp strokes I'd seen in the documents she kept at home. The confirmation landed without sound, like a stone dropped into water too deep to see. The clerk clicked again and opened a request I hadn't known existed. My current room, the one I had shared with my wife for decades, was marked for reassignment. The notes explained that the space would be repurposed for household efficiency, specifically for a guest office expansion. She said it matter-of-factly, unaware of how those words landed. My room wasn't being protected. It was being cleared. Then she moved to a different part of the file, showing me a request flagged by their system. My daughter-in-law had tried to fast-track an inspection, citing safety concerns that required immediate action. The clerk mentioned this with a tone of mild confusion. The house had passed every inspection for years, and no new report had been submitted to support such a claim. It was evident that the urgency had come from her, not from any real issue. I didn't speak. I didn't ask why she had done it. I simply let the facts stack themselves one after another. Each page carried something she never expected me to see. This wasn't guesswork or miscommunication. It wasn't an overprotective relative acting out of emotion. It was a strategy, planned, organized, and quietly moving forward beneath the surface of my daily life. When I left the office, the hallway felt colder than when I had walked in. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't shout or shake. It pressed down slowly, settling into the one place I had hoped it wouldn't reach: my understanding of the people living under my roof. I met with a social services worker the next morning, bringing the copies of every document I had collected so far. We sat in a small office that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, the kind of room where people were used to hearing stories that didn't come with easy explanations. She read through each page slowly, stacking the documents in a careful order as she worked. Her expression didn't shift much, but her eyes told me she had seen situations like this before. Situations that didn't end with simple misunderstandings. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk and spoke with a calm that carried more weight than any raised voice could. She said the combination of forged paperwork, relocation requests, and pressured decision-making showed clear signs of coercion. Then she explained that this pattern matched cases they handled involving housing manipulation and senior displacement. She didn't have to explain what that meant. The word displacement stayed in my mind long after she said it, settling with the kind of heaviness that doesn't leave quickly. She submitted a request on my behalf to place an official freeze on all relocation documents tied to my name. The freeze meant nothing could move forward, not a signature, not a request, not even an inspection, without my direct approval in person. She typed the note into the system with deliberate motions, saving each step while explaining that it would block any attempt to shift me out of my home, whether by accident or design. Her tone never drifted into alarm, but the seriousness behind her words spoke plainly. Before I left, she gave one more piece of advice. She told me not to sign anything my daughter-in-law brought into the house. Not a form, not a letter, not a simple acknowledgement. She said people in my position were often pressured to sign under the guise of care. She said it without judgment, without assuming anything about my relationship with my family. It was instruction, not opinion, and it settled into place alongside everything else I had learned. By the time I got home, my phone was vibrating with missed calls. Her name filled the screen again and again. The first voicemail carried her usual sweetness, asking if I was all right and whether I needed anything from the store. The second one sharpened, asking why I wasn't answering. The third slipped into irritation, telling me we had important matters to settle, and she couldn't handle everything alone. By the fourth, her voice carried impatience threaded through forced gentleness, the kind used to push someone into a corner without sounding harsh. That evening she called again, insisting we needed to attend a joint meeting she had scheduled on my behalf. She said it was necessary, that I needed to cooperate, that things were moving faster than either of us expected. I listened without responding, letting her words run their course. The urgency in her tone was no longer about my safety or comfort. It was about maintaining momentum in a plan she thought I still didn't understand. I ended the call without giving her an answer. The facts were no longer scattered pieces. They formed a line pointing in one direction. Whatever she wanted from that meeting, it wasn't clarity, it wasn't honesty, it was control. As I set the phone down, a simple truth settled in my mind. A confrontation was no longer something I could avoid. It was coming, whether either of us wanted it or not. I spent the night gathering every document I had collected, laying them out on the dining table like pieces of a story someone else had tried to write for me. The forged forms, the relocation requests, the notes in her handwriting, each page carried its own quiet proof. I made clean copies and placed them in a folder I kept beside my jacket. The house felt different as I worked, tighter somehow, as if the walls were holding their breath along with me. I wasn't afraid. I was preparing. The next morning, I reached out to a senior rights advocate recommended by the social worker. I didn't go into every detail, just enough for him to understand what kind of situation I was in. His questions were steady, measured, the questions of someone who had seen too many families twist care into control. He told me to bring all the documents to the upcoming meeting and said he would arrange to be there. His calmness didn't ease the weight in my chest, but it gave it structure, something I could work with. When she arrived later that day, her behavior had changed again. She moved through the house with restless energy, opening and closing drawers as if searching for something she didn't want me to notice missing. One moment she wiped her eyes, saying she felt unappreciated after everything she'd done. The next she accused me of not trusting her, of making simple things harder than they needed to be. Then came a soft apology, followed by a comment sharp enough to undo it. Each shift was quick, like she was trying on different versions of herself to see which one would bring me back into her orbit. She sat across from me at the table, sliding a stack of papers toward my hand. She said it was the final authorization, the last piece needed to secure my future. She emphasized how urgent it was, how I had to sign before the opportunity passed. Her voice carried pressure wrapped in concern, and she leaned forward with a practiced softness meant to nudge me more than comfort me. I looked at the top page without reacting, keeping my breath steady, my expression neutral. I told her I would sign it at the meeting. Her shoulders relaxed in a way she couldn't hide. Whatever she expected to happen in that room, she believed she would control it. She didn't ask to see the folder sitting beside my chair, and I didn't offer it. I just nodded at the right moments, letting her think the afternoon would unfold the way she needed it to. That evening, the advocate called to confirm he would be present. He said the housing officer had been notified and the room would be prepared. His tone carried no drama, no judgment, just a quiet readiness that matched the resolve forming in me. I thanked him and placed the phone down gently, letting the silence settle. The next day, as I walked into the building for the meeting, I felt the shift in the air before I even reached the door. My daughter-in-law walked slightly ahead of me, confident, certain she would guide the conversation like she always did. But I kept my steps measured and my thoughts clear. I knew the truth wasn't staying hidden any longer, and this time I wouldn't be the only one in the room who saw it. She walked into the meeting room with her chin lifted, shoulders stiff, and a look of practiced offense on her face. She told the housing officer she was deeply concerned about my stability and apologized for the confusion their office had caused. Her voice carried the same polished softness she used when she wanted to sound reasonable in front of strangers. She even placed a hand on my arm as if she were guiding me through a difficult moment. I didn't move. The advocate sat beside me, watching quietly. The housing officer nodded politely, then opened a folder on the table. Before he said a word, the advocate leaned forward and addressed the room in a calm, steady tone. He explained that multiple requests had been made on my behalf without my knowledge, including relocation forms, expedited approval requests, and safety claims. He kept his voice low, careful, leaving no space for exaggeration. Her expression tightened, but she forced a smile, insisting she only acted out of concern because I was overwhelmed lately. The advocate placed the first piece of evidence on the table, a printed relocation form with my name typed neatly at the top. He slid it forward so she could see the signature line. The housing officer confirmed the signature didn't match any verified document from my record. Her face flickered, just once before she reached for the page with trembling fingers. She said she didn't know how that form was filed. She said the office must have mixed things up, but her voice cracked on a word she usually delivered cleanly. Then came the forged signature. The advocate placed it between us, the shaky imitation of my handwriting sitting in plain sight. Her eyes darted across the page, then toward the officer, then back to me. She let out a small, shaky breath followed by a sudden burst of tears. She said she hadn't meant for anything to look wrong. She claimed she had filled it in, for convenience, and the plan was always to have me sign later. The words spilled fast, as if explaining quickly might undo what was in front of her. When the tears didn't shift the room, she changed direction. Her voice sharpened as she accused me of forgetting conversations we clearly had. She said I had approved everything weeks ago, that I must have forgotten because I had been having trouble keeping track. The advocate didn't react. The housing officer didn't react. They simply waited for the storm to pass. She looked between the three of us, realizing the accusation hadn't gained the traction she needed. The officer pulled out a timeline laying each date and request in order. Every form she filed, every claim she made, every attempt to fast-track approvals. He spoke without raising his voice, simply outlining the process and confirming none of the submissions matched protocol for a senior acting on his own behalf. He didn't accuse her. He didn't speculate. He showed the pattern exactly as it existed, and the room took in each detail with quiet finality. Her face changed piece by piece. The outrage faded. The tears stopped. The last of her practiced sweetness drained away. What remained was the realization she had run out of angles, out of explanations, out of places to hide the truth she had tried to build behind my back. She didn't speak after that. She just sat there, frozen in the kind of silence that follows a plan collapsing in full daylight. A social worker from the department arrived 2 days after the meeting. She carried a thin folder under her arm and spoke with the calm, measured professionalism of someone who handled difficult situations without letting emotion cloud the process. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked a few clarifying questions about the documents the housing officer submitted. When she was finished, she wrote a formal report for attempted elder housing manipulation. The language was clinical, but the meaning settled heavily in the room. Her pen moved with quiet certainty, each stroke marking a line between what had been attempted and what would no longer be allowed. Later that afternoon, I received confirmation that all relocation requests tied to my name had been permanently voided. Nothing could move forward now, not a signature, not an inspection, not a casual follow-up call. The freeze held firm, and any future attempt would require a face-to-face meeting with me present. It was the kind of protection I hadn't known I needed, but one I understood the importance of now. I sat on the edge of the bed with the notice in my hand, letting the reality settle in piece by piece. My daughter-in-law received her own notice the same day. She didn't call me, but I heard from the social worker that she would be contacted for questioning. The possibility of charges wasn't a threat. It was a procedural step. Everything would depend on the intention behind her actions, the pattern she created, and the evidence gathered. The system wasn't out to punish her. It was out to prevent harm, but knowing she had walked far enough down this path to trigger an investigation left a hollow ache that didn't ease with time. The family reaction came fast. My son called, sounding more confused than angry. He struggled to believe any of it, insisting there had to be another explanation. A few relatives hinted that maybe I misunderstood paperwork, or that stress had made me misinterpret her help. Others stayed silent, uncomfortable with the idea that someone within the family circle could step so far out of bounds. Their doubt wasn't loud, but it cut in a different way, tight and quiet, settling under the ribs where trust used to live. When I returned home, the house felt heavier than it had in years. The rooms were familiar, but the comfort they once held was cracked by the knowledge of how close I had come to losing them. I walked through the hallway slowly, stopping in the doorway of the room she had tried to repurpose. The space hadn't changed, but my understanding of it had. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was the place she had tried to erase. That evening the advocate called to check in. His voice carried the same calm steadiness he had shown the first day we spoke. He confirmed all protections were active, that my file was safeguarded, and that no decisions could be made without my explicit involvement. He didn't say anything about the emotional weight of the situation, but his quiet professionalism offered a kind of grounding I didn't realize I needed. When the call ended, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the slow tick of the clock. I thought about the trust I had placed in my family, the ease with which I had let someone step into roles I should have guarded more closely. The betrayal didn't feel sharp, it felt hollow, an emptiness carved not by anger, but by the realization that the danger had come from someone who lived under my roof. The days after everything settled were quieter, but not in the same way they had been after my wife passed. This quiet was clean, steady, and mine. I rebuilt my routines one piece at a time, taking back each task I had let slip into other hands. I reviewed my own mail, managed my own documents, and organized the house according to what made sense to me, not what someone else thought was efficient. There was a calm that came with moving at my own pace again, a calm I didn't realize I had missed until it returned. I set clear boundaries, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Some people step into your life under the banner of help, speaking in soft tones and carrying tidy explanations. But help can be a disguise if you're not paying attention. I learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive with raised voices or obvious threats. Sometimes it enters through small favors and kind words, working its way into the spaces where trust lives. Looking back, the signs were quiet, almost polite, but they were there, and I see them clearly now. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone my age, it's this: keep control of your documents, your signatures, and your space. Don't hand over responsibilities because someone insists you should. Ask questions, verify every change, walk into every office yourself. People mean well until they don't, and by the time you realize the difference, the damage can be difficult to undo. It isn't paranoia, it's protection. And there's nothing wrong with defending what you've earned through a lifetime of work. I also understand now that love, whether through marriage, blood, or shared history, is not a shield. It doesn't guarantee safety or honesty or good intentions. I cared about my family, but caring never changed the truth of what happened. Accepting that didn't make me bitter, it just made me aware. Affection and trust are not the same thing, and confusing them can leave a person vulnerable in ways they don't see until it's almost too late. Still, I find comfort in knowing I acted when I did. The moment I stepped into that office, the moment I listened to the unease instead of brushing it aside, everything started shifting back toward where it should have stayed. I protected the home my wife and I built, the space we shaped together over decades. Losing that would have been a second kind of grief, one I don't think I would have carried easily. I'm grateful I didn't have to face it. What stays with me now isn't the anger or the chaos. It's the resilience that rose quietly, the part of me that still knows how to stand when the ground feels uncertain. Age hasn't softened that. If anything, it's made it more precise. I know my limits, but I also know my strength, and that strength is enough. When I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the last bit of daylight settle across the yard, I hold one truth close: a man has to guard his peace, his space, and his name. No one else will do it for him. And once he learns that, he moves through the world with a clarity nothing can take from him.